yes, the essays are, as I said, they add insights, they add context. They're not going to drive decisions. The main things we're looking at are we're trying to predict your academic performance in our program. We're trying to predict your professional potential.
So the first thing I would say is to always remember that your essays are part of an application package. And so you do not and should not repeat kind of basic bio data.
The point of the essay is to prove to me that you're a leader, right? Out of the 9,000, 10,000 people who are applying, this is ultimately a leadership contest.
Focus on verbs. What did you do? Right? What was the outcome? And so when you have a tight space, a lot of times I'll ask, like, what is the one thing you want to convey in this essay? What's the most important idea? And so let that be the guide that helps you make choices about what you include or what you keep out. The best writing is often simple and not simplistic, but like stripped down and clear. If you have to tell me something explicitly, like I'm a great leader, I'm a problem solver, at that point, your essay has failed. I should see that from the examples that you use and the stories that you provide.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the GMAT Club Podcast. I am Maria Wickvila of ApplicantLab.com, joined as always with Brian Phoebe from GuruFi.com. And today's topic is going to be an exciting one. We are going to talk about essays that sing and the role that essays play in the MBA admissions process. We are joined by a very special guest today, Bruce DelMonico, Head of Admissions at the Yale School of Management. Bruce, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Marie and Brian, for having me. Looking forward to it.
So, Bruce, why don't we get started with, I think, one of the fundamental questions that applicants have when they approach the MBA application process, and that is, why do I even need to write any essays at all to begin with? After all, you've got my resume, you've got my recommendation, you know who I am and where I've been. So why do schools even ask for essays to begin with?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think, it's a topic that actually I think does come up every so often, even within admissions, and thinking about what we're looking for, what we're trying to evaluate, how we're trying to measure it. Um, Essays, as you say, we do have your resume, we have your academic record, we have your test scores, we have your recommendations, we have other things to evaluate candidates. I think the essay tends to be, for us at least, and obviously I can speak for Yale, and not, I think other schools probably approach things roughly similarly, but every school has its own distinct way of approaching the application and what they're looking for. But I think, the essay does help us get some sort of sense of some complementary information, a little bit more personal information about you, a little more in-depth information about you as an individual. And I think that does help us get a fuller sense of you as a candidate, your potential for our program, and both in the program and beyond. So it does provide some, I think, some incremental information for us that, above and beyond all the other things that we are evaluating and that we're asking for during the process.
One thing that has come up both in the press and I think within the admissions world is how ChatGPT and other generative AI,
Yeah.
and I haven't seen as much specifically with respect to MBA, but certainly like at the college level, and it's kind of in the background of all personal statement discussions. Does this change kind of your overall approach to admissions, specifically with respect to personal statements and how you think about them? If you're comfortable, does Yale have a specific policy about what's allowed or not allowed? Like, how has this changed things? Because it seems like this stick of dynamite that's kind of dropped into the admissions world in the last couple of years, really the last
Yes.
year.
Yeah. As well as every other component of our lives, really. So, no, yeah, that's an important topic, and really obviously a very timely one. We do have an AI statement in our application that we developed last year, and that we developed actually in conjunction with ChatGPT. So we tried to use it to help us with our own statement. And it's really more guidance. It's more guidelines. We don't, it's not a prohibition. We're not saying what you can or can't do, but just how you should approach using AI in the process. And really the idea that's meant to, as some people always say, perfect rather than pervert the process. We ask you to treat it as a trusted advisor to provide sort of high level sort of guidance and sort of feedback, but not to you shouldn't be writing your essays with ChatGPT. They shouldn't be, it should be coming up with a topic, that your and I guess there are at least two aspects of how ChatGPT can help. It can be with the content generation, and it can be with the kind of the writing and editing and stylistic elements. And I think, at both of those should really be your work. I mean, ChatGPT should not come up with a story about your life that is not what you've actually done. It shouldn't create something out of whole cloth. And I think in terms of the writing, it really should be, it could be, maybe you might otherwise have like a friend or a colleague, maybe copy edit or take a look. And maybe ChatGPT that might be useful in cleaning it up, but it shouldn't be actually writing the content. And I think how we approach essays as a result, I don't think it's dramatically changed or dramatically different. We're assuming that what you're writing about is something that actually happened to you, and that or that things that matter to you. Um, and we've never, to the extent you use ChatGPT to kind of wordsmith, or we're not, as we say, this isn't a PhD literature program, so we're not making decisions about you as your candidacy based on how well or poorly written your essay is. So ChatGPT is not going to provide incremental benefits in that regard. But I think it is important that what you're writing is your own voice, and your own experiences. And so ChatGPT can maybe provide some high level guidance, but really should not be replacing what you're doing. And so we're not prohibiting the use of AI, but we want people to be thoughtful and mindful about how they're using it in the ways it can help, as opposed to kind of undermine what they're trying to accomplish in their application.
Bruce, you mentioned earlier that one of the goals of the essays is to try to get to know the candidate on a deeper personal level. Have you seen any examples where maybe someone has used ChatGPT, or you think that they've used ChatGPT for an essay, and as a result, they've perhaps missed out on being able to convey that more personal aspect of their stories?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I could point to it. I mean, it's still so new. I don't know if I could point to an example and we don't. I don't know that we're so good. I mean, as someone who writes using M dashes so much, I always blend. I'm always. It's frustrating to hear that that's kind of the tell for ChatGPT, because that's my writing normally, and I feel like people probably think that everything I write is AI generated. So I don't know if we're always great uh, at um, identifying this, but I do feel like there's a certain. I mean, having used ChatGPT myself, I do feel like there is a certain voice that it tends to use, and a certain way that it writes, which is actually quite nice writing. Um, and I think have been some examples where we see very pleasant writing, but it feels more distant, if that makes sense. And I think that that's really, I mean, I'm sure we will get into it. I think one of the things that I advise when talking to candidates about essays is really, topically write about what matters to you, because you're going to be much more compelling. And I think even if you're not the best writer, if it's your voice and your words, that that kind of um that sincerity, that kind of I don't like to use the word passion, because it might doesn't always rise to the level of passion, but like, that feeling will come through. And sometimes I think ChatGPT writes, and it does a nice job of putting together nice words and sentences and paragraphs, but it's not always the most compelling or in nature. I'm not articulating it great, but hopefully you get the sense of what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think one of the problems, looking through the forums and people talking about this, there's so much talk about kind of the game theory of it, like prompt engineering. And
Oh,
so,
yeah.
for example, you might say, here's my CV. I'm applying to Yale School of Management. Based on what they value,
Hmm.
create an outline or create a personal statement or something like that.
Yeah.
And then, it's this challenge of, one of the things that you have to balance when you're working with someone live is you do want to make sure that obviously the person's essay is responsive, both to the prompt specifically and also
Right.
kind of to what the school cares about. But you kind of get like this ham-fisted approach with Chat GPT, where it's like, oh, here's like the 5 buzzwords that our scouring of the internet will find.
Right.
Therefore, we're going to like morph your life to fit this in ways that often don't quite work.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a good observation. And I think it does maybe heighten the tendency or the concern, which I feel like over my time in admissions, I think applicants have gotten away from, thankfully, and have maybe been counseled away from, or kind of realize that you don't need to kind of force fit your application to what you perceive the school cares about, or what you think the touch points you need to, or the points you need to hit are. And I think that's a good point, that maybe ChatGPT might kind of be pulling people back into that vortex of sorts, and kind of finding as you say, the five things that Yale SOM cares about, or the five buzzwords that we want to include in the essay. I think that the challenge is, from a game theory perspective, as you say, you're trying to differentiate and make yourself more compelling. But if you're using the same buzzwords as everyone else, you're going to make yourself less compelling. You're actually going to make yourself look like everybody else. And that's something and that's another reason why you should resist the temptation to try to tell us what you think we want to hear. And I think, to the extent ChatGPT kind of feeds into that tendency, and maybe, to your point, I think is a great one. It might be undermining your candidacy rather than improving it. And I can say, for us, and I imagine for other schools, we're not looking for you to kind of tell us why there's this alignment. We're not going to be making a decision based on what the essay says. We're going to look at your resume. We're going to look at your academics, your work experience, and see how that all fits together, and not just what you say in our 500-word essay. So I think it goes much beyond kind of how you present yourself. It's really about how you've lived your life and what you've done.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the nice things about the Yale essay set specifically, right? I mean, for years it was, what's the biggest commitment you've ever made? And then recently, in the previous cycles, you've expanded that out to give people one of three options, right? So
Yeah.
it's gone from being the biggest commitment you've ever made to, what's a community that's been most meaningful to you, or what's a challenge that you've overcome. And I think one of the nice things about, and maybe I don't even think that you guys did this on purpose, you were ahead of the curve, but I think that these are topics that are a little bit hard for ChatGPT to figure out, right? So if I feed it my resume, it might say like, "Oh, it sounds like that P&L model that you built was a challenge," but that's gonna fall flat, right? That's not like an interpersonal challenge. It certainly doesn't talk about, what mattered, what commitment I've made most, that is the biggest commitment in my life. So I think you guys have been ahead of the curve. So speaking of the Yale essays, when very well-meaning candidates submit their essays to Yale, and maybe you think to yourself, "Oh, man, they didn't quite get it," right? They seem to have missed the mark a little. In which ways do you see candidates missing that mark, or perhaps submitting something that's suboptimal?
Yeah, no, great question, and thank you for yeah, we did change the prompts before ChatGPT. Hope maybe it has that ancillary benefit of maybe being a little bit ChatGPT proof, but it definitely was not a response to. Um, but I think, um, maybe getting back to Brian's question, and can maybe kind of harking back to that emerging sort of yours, Marie, with his. One of the things we see that people maybe where they, I don't say fall flat, but maybe where they kind of, it's a little bit of a missed opportunity. Our prompts, we have three, as you say, we have three prompts. You choose one of those three. They don't have to connect to the school. They don't have to connect to the MBA. And maybe this is where, schools have different essays, and maybe other schools do ask about, why our school, or why this degree, or what do you hope to do afterwards. We're not looking to make those connections. And I think sometimes candidates feel like they do need to do that. They do need to explain why Yale, or why you're applying, or why, what you need to do with the MBA. And I think that tends to water down the application, and it's also it's valuable real estate, because it is 500 words. There's not a lot of time to say what you want to say, to devote some of that real estate on something that's beyond or outside of the prompt. There's limits how much time you can actually talk about the prompt itself.
I also think inside the application form, I think you guys inside the application form also have like a little mini section where someone can describe a little bit more pragmatically what are their career interests, how are they pursuing them. So it's not like, there's nothing in the Yale application about that career narrative.
Yeah.
It's definitely still there, but it's I think it's good to emphasize to folks watching this that main core Yale essay is not a why Yale and why are you good for Yale explicitly
Yeah.
essay. So thanks
Yeah.
for that.
No, I think that's right. We do have that small statement elsewhere where we talk about your sort of post MBA goals, and we do care about that. We do care about why the MBA, but we also, we think about where to ask for that information, and what the best place is, and what the best timing is. And so The essay for us is not that place. And I guess the broader point obviously is for other schools that might be the place. And so you obviously speaks to the idea of answering the prompt, which is kind of the most maybe the most fundamental foundational piece of advice admissions officers give and should give, because all our essays are different and we're looking for different things. And you need to be mindful of that when you're writing a response.
So one of the things that I've noticed over the years, just in terms of like a mood that I will get
Hmm.
from clients, is that they a lot of times view the admissions process as like it's impenetrable. They don't exactly know, and they view
Yep.
the admissions officers almost like performing this weird inscrutable alchemy that they can't figure out. And so I
Right.
want to just for a second hop inside the room, right? Um, so when you think about 3 or 4 critical things, you have Brian Foby's application for Yale School of Management in front of you. The personal statement is there. What are the things that specifically you're looking for? What are things that would give you, would give me the boost up or the thumbs down? And, without spilling too much personal data from people, are there examples that you remember of really great essays or stories that people told that really moved the needle for you in
Yeah.
terms of their application?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's lots of stuff to think about. And I would maybe start by, in terms of the black box piece and sort of the inscrutability, we try to, and I would say from personal experience, I've, have put already 2 daughters through the college application process. My son is on his way in a year or so. And being on the other side, you appreciate how challenging that is, and how much of a black box it does seem, even for someone who's in admissions in a different context. The undergraduate experience is, I don't have any better insights than anyone else, and you definitely appreciate what it's like to be on that other side. We've always tried to make the Yale process as hopefully as straightforward and as transparent as possible. Obviously, recognizing that people aren't in the actual room where decisions are made, but understanding what goes into those decisions and how we try to think about them. Um, and sort of with that setup in that context, I would say, I know that the title of today's session is Essays That Sing. I would say you don't, as someone who's a horrible singer, I would say your essays, as long as you can kind of carry a tune, you're okay. Like you don't have to be an opera singer to get in. Like it's not like this is going to be the make or break. And that's one thing I try to tell people in the process. Talking to your question about being in the room, um, the essays are, as I said, they add insights, they add context. They're not gonna drive a decision. So if someone is, the main things, just to step back, the main things we're looking at are we're trying to predict your academic performance in our program. And not that you'll be the top performer, but that you'll be able to kind of manage that you're prepared for the program. We're trying to predict your professional potential afterwards. And then we were trying to get a sense of what you will contribute to our community, both on campus and the larger sort of Yale SOM and Yale communities. Um, and so we have things that will get at that. So if you say you don't have a competitive academic profile, the essay is not going to overcome that. But assuming you have a competitive academic profile, competitive professional profile, and we feel like you will contribute to our community, the essays can help get more of a sense of some aspects of those traits that we are looking at that will inform those three things that we're trying to predict. And to I know to feel free to redirect me if I'm getting a little bit sort of off target, but I think in terms of our essays in particular, and again, every school will be looking at different things, or could be looking at different things. The Maria, the prompts you mentioned that we ask about in terms of the commitment, the community, the challenge. What we're looking at is how you sort of demonstrated your support for or kind of approach to that commitment, the community, and the challenge. And it's really trying to get at some behaviors that we feel we care about in terms of our students, our graduates being sort of action oriented, and following through on what they do. And so thinking about what those behaviors are the things we care about, and that can plug into how we're looking at your academics, how we're looking at your professional life, how we're looking at your community engagement. So it's kind of an overlay. It's not going to be the driver, but it will definitely be informative and it'll definitely provide complementary information to us. So hopefully that's helpful. And then in terms of, I think there was a Brian, you had a one aspect of the question was ones that I might need to restate ones that fell flatter that maybe where they didn't hit the mark or miss the mark.
Yeah, just ones that were memorable to you that stood out of
Yeah,
like, "This is just a great essay,"
yeah,
and what about it was it that stood out to you as exceptional in either direction?
yeah, yeah. I think, and I'm trying to. That's always a tricky question because I'm trying to think about. I can think about essays that really stood out because of what the person discussed in terms of such as someone who applied who sort of was a foster parent and the sort of the commitment that involved. But I mentioned it just now, so I did say it, but I always reluctant to identify specific topics that people talk about because you don't need to have done that to have a good essay. I think the things for me that stand out, and I'm actually at the right now. I probably read fewer essays than just about anybody else on the team, in terms of sort of direct application reading. Um, but seeing from my experiences just broadly, seeing essays and then having read them over the years and then seeing them in other contexts in committee and elsewhere. I think the things that will allow an essay to, I'll say, carry a tune as opposed to maybe not sing, but are less about what topic is written about, but getting a sense that there is a real uh uh I don't a real learning that comes from what it is that you write about, and growth, and sort of the so what. So you describe it, describe it a commitment, you describe a challenge, you describe a community. So and why is it that why is or is that thing important to you, and what how did it help you in developing in a certain way? And I think that can be, there are some essays where it's more descriptive, and which are or fine essays, but they don't necessarily connect the dots to like the so what. And I think that tends to kind of make an essay a little bit more compelling, and where you tie it to the things that matter to you, why they matter, how you've demonstrated your, as I said, your support for whatever topic you're writing about. So independent of the topic, it's kind of like connecting that last little piece that I think often makes an essay a little bit more compelling, than one that is maybe a little bit more descriptive or just kind of laying out what the example is of the commitment or the challenge of the community.
And one of the things that you've touched upon a few times already is mentioning, like, we wanna see how you approach the commitment, not just what the commitment is.
Yep.
Um, so I can say that at least when I have worked with people on this essay and it has not quite carried the tune, it's been a little, discordant, is when they focus so much on the what. So,
Yeah.
for example, and it almost reads like I have this allergy to inspirational poster speak. So the biggest commitment I've ever made is to justice. And I believe that justice is important because it's good, and it's good because it's just, and it just sort of, it
Yeah.
doesn't really provide anything concrete. Like, how can you need to prove to me that this is actually
Right.
something that you've committed to. This is actually a community that matters to you. Instead of
Yeah.
simply saying, well, community is a good thing. Yeah, of course it is. Like,
Yeah.
that's, we all agree on that. Um, so I think one of the ways that sometimes applicants to Yale might sometimes miss the mark, um, and not if they've worked with someone like Brian or they've they've used Applicant Lab, but they might sort of kind of focus so much on trying to build this lofty statement about, here are things that are important.
Yeah.
Commitment is important, and people should have commitments, and they should follow through with them. But they don't really make it personal. So I think one of the things that you've
Yeah.
really pointed out here that's been great has been making sure that it is about you, and that there's also something concrete to it,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
opposed to just, kind of going going on and on.
Yeah,
Um,
I think, and it's, I think that, I mean, that was probably a better answer than I gave. Appreciate that, because I think that is right. Just to reiterate and reinforce, I think we do tell people, it should be concrete. It's not meant to be sort of theoretical or intellectual, or sometimes a concept that people use to identify a whole series of different commitments or a series of different community. Like, it's not meant to be a kind of a vessel for you to throw a lot of examples in. It's meant to be a thing, a commitment, a community, a challenge, and then you kind of unpack that in the essay as opposed to, and it should be concrete, as you say, not sort of theoretical or ideological. in nature.
I mean, that makes me happy to hear that because so often I think people focus on, especially when they come to a service like ours, like they feel like they don't need to do the additional work of interrogating themselves.
Hmm.
And it's just about writing really pretty. And the thing I'll often tell people is like, look, if you don't give me more or you don't have more, Shakespeare could write your personal statement and it's not going to move the needle because there has to be something substantive there that moves beyond it. And I think in some ways that's like a problem that ChatGPT has solved because at the very or Grammarly, in the sense that at the very least, everyone should be able to write a smooth, coherent sentence,
Right.
and something that is structurally acceptable on some level. And to build on that, one of the things I think about when this question of like what's important to you or the biggest commitment you've made, a really good way that you can use ChatGPT, that's perfectly acceptable ethically, is to take the thing that you have written and chop off the first couple of sentences where you might
Mm.
say explicitly, what's important to me is X, put it in there and ask it based on this, what's my most important values or what's the biggest commitment I made? See what it says.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times people will feel, to Maria's point, like I've got to have this lofty thing that I explain, but their story doesn't actually get to that. And so, I guess you're just sort of using the algorithm in the same way that you might use a person, which is like, am I saying the thing that I actually think that I'm saying?
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. I think advice that I think admissions officers have given for a long time is to, give your friend the essay without giving them the prompt and see if they can guess what the prompt is. And this is a similar type of thing. I think it's a very good exercise and to make sure that you are on track. And I think that's really interesting observation, and I think correct observation too. Is ChatGPT in some sense is liberating, in that everybody has access to a tool that can make them good writers. And we've never focused on writing as the thing that we're measuring, but certainly now that everything it's kind of flattened the writing level for just about everybody to some degree, or has there's a chance that that's the case. So we even maybe less focused on writing. It's more of a check to us to like really think about the other aspects of the essay that are we're looking at.
Can I follow up by asking you some the SOM specific things?
Yeah,
This balance between professional stories and like kind of personal stories.
yeah,
This is something that came up in a previous podcast, and we'll probably end up talking about it again today when we review some client or some sample essays. Um, how much needs to be focused on the professional aspect, and what do you see as the role of like a personal story within the structure of the application?
yeah, yeah. Well, we tell people that you can write about. You don't have to write about something professional. It can be personal. And we've had many personal commitments and challenges and communities that people have talked about. It doesn't have to be necessarily kind of a community. Doesn't have to be like in a workplace ERG or something you overcame sort of in the office. Um, and I think we recently ran the numbers, and I can't remember. It has been in the past about 50-50 in terms of the percentage of people who write versus personal versus professional. I can't remember it's exactly that now, but it's pretty close, I'm sure. And the admit rate is roughly the same regardless of what you write about, including also the which three topics. I think still a few more people write about the commitment than the other two, and I think that might just be a legacy effect that was the only topic for a while, and so I think people maybe was still a little bit more predisposed to that. But now that we're a few years into the three essay choice, that might be less so. Um, but it's very much the case that it doesn't have to be professional in nature. It could be a personal essay. Obviously, understand that if you're writing about a personal topic, it's in the context of a professional school application, and I think that's another way. Not too many people, but sometimes people maybe go a little bit astray by getting a little too personal and maybe not having I think self-awareness is part of one of the things we're getting trying to gauge too, and not really having that self-awareness about understanding the context in which they are writing. And the personal means it's not professional, but doesn't mean it's like so personal that it's not really relevant to an MBA application. Um, but we do have people who write about both. We welcome both. There's no benefit to writing about one or the other. And again, that's another reason why we don't have you connect the topic to why an MBA or why Yale, because if you write about something personal, maybe there isn't a connection, and maybe it's just a commitment or a challenge or a community that's independent of your professional aspirations or your reason for wanting to go to business school.
I think that's really good feedback on for folks who might wanna be writing about the personal element, like, make sure that it's showing aspects of you that will still contribute to the Yale SOM community specifically, and then their broader professional communities, beyond that. When people write about a professional topic for this, where do you maybe see them, uh, submit something that could have been a little bit stronger?
Yeah, um, I think there are a few different things I would say. And one thing I think about in May, I think you might have thrown it out there earlier is you know, it's sort of like a challenge. If you said, "Oh gosh, I had this project and I had real difficulty with formatting the spreadsheet," and this project that I'm sure that was a challenge, but that might not rise to the level of what we're talking about. And again, we don't get a ton of those, but I think you want to just think about the scale and the scope of what that challenge is. Because we're looking for something meaningful, something significant. It doesn't have to be. I climbed Mount Everest and that was really challenging. Then you don't have to be at that level. But think about especially if it's in the professional context, what 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 the scale is of what you're talking about. And also, it doesn't have to be the case as I'm thinking about it. This is a little more extemporaneous. Um, but think about, it could be helpful to think about the kinds of behaviors that, to your point, Maria, that will map to and the MBA environment. And so the kinds of things will be doing in the MBA and beyond. And to the extent it's relevant to that, it's kind of informative of how you will behave in the different contexts. It's one of the reasons one of the things we're looking to get a sense of is how you behaved in the past to get a picture of how you'll behave in the future. And so if it's a professional example, hopefully it by definition is, but make sure that try to make sure those examples will have some, translate to some degree into the sort of the degree and beyond.
And in terms of fit, I know that this is often like, the it's at the heart of the why Yale question.
Yeah.
What are things that people can do to make a nod toward the fact that you would feel like this person would thrive here in New Haven with us, and they would be a good fit within our school? I know that one of the specific things a lot of times people do maybe too much of is just to sort of list clubs and activities at the school that they
Right.
think they want to participate in. But if I'm trying to demonstrate like Brian would do well at Yale and
Yeah.
he's the type of person who would thrive, how might you go about indicating that within the essays?
Yeah, and I think, and again, that's another one where I don't think you need to overthink it or try to kind of predict fit. For us, at least, fit's always very challenging. It's very fraught because it's such an amorphous concept. It can mean different things to different people. It introduces subjectivity to the process. It can sometimes introduce bias to the process. If this person doesn't fit for reasons that they're not like me, therefore they can't. They're not going to be as competitive or compelling. Um, so we always tread very lightly with that, and we look again and not necessarily at what you say about yourself, but what you've demonstrated through your entire application. So that doesn't all rest on the essay for you to kind of make the case for kind of why Yale, why you should be part of our community, why you should join us at SOM and in New Haven. Um, we have all the other parts of your application, and so I think that's where, to the extent people feel like they need to get that fit piece in, and need to kind of tie their essay up in kind of a bow in that way. I would maybe resist that urge because fit is fraught. It can mean so many different things. That's not necessarily what we're looking for in the essay, or even in the process more generally. So I don't know that you're necessarily advancing your candidacy for us at least. Obviously every school might treat things a little bit differently, but that's sort of how we approach it.
Just to jump back into the black box of admissions, just to pull it back to that for a second,
Yeah.
could you walk us through what happens when on your team's side? So I've submitted my application, the deadline is passed, and what happens? Like how many reads?
Yeah.
Is it more than one person reading it? Just a quick overview of that, and so within that, like, do people read the essays? do people tend to read the essays as the first thing they read? Like, do they jump right to that? I'm sure
Yeah.
it probably differs by person, but do you have like a sense of like, oh, usually on our team people read the resume first, or
Yeah.
any sense of that?
No, yeah, it's interesting. I've had some people asking more. It feels like people ask more frequently the sort of the more sort of behind the scenes kind of black box, order of review and that type of thing. Um, and I think so. Everybody gets reviewed by at least two different people, and so you're getting two different sets of eyes on your application. And sometimes they go through more reviews. We actually we send some interview invitations out early, pretty soon after after the deadline, but then we are reviewing applications and bringing people to what we call interview committee to make decisions on interview invitations. So we have, and those that's different people than the people who review the file. And then after the interview, people will come to the full committee to be discussed. So everybody's not reading, but definitely seeing the file. So you'll get two different reviews, and then so interview committee review, and then sort of the decision committee review. So seeing a good number, and we built some. I think it, I think we could, if we wanted to, we could build a more efficient process in terms of time. But I think the process we've built we think is thorough, and we try to and we try to make it as thorough and consistent and fair as possible. And so maybe intentionally a little inefficient, just to make sure we're getting the reviews and we're able to compare the entire pool in a kind of equitable way. Um, and in terms of how people read the file, it does vary from reader to reader. There's no prescribed order. In our system, it does. We see sort of the personal information, and then the academics, and then professional, and then I think essay recommendation, activities. I think that's the order. I might be a little bit. There might be one of those recommendations that might be flipped. Sometimes people will go in that order. I think it is more typical probably to go chronologically. So your academics are probably first, and then your professional experience. Um, it's not. I would say it's probably not uncommon to jump to the resume first as a nice summation of your candidacy. I think essay, I would say, is probably very rarely the thing that would be read first. That tends to come a little bit later on the process, just because we want to have a better sense of you from other sources before reading the essay. Um, so I would say, again, it varies. I would say probably most commonly the sort of the academic, professional, the recommendations, then the essay and activities in that order. But again, it's gonna change. I
So
hope
your
that's helpful.
discussion about fit was really useful.
Yeah.
And so my last listed question here, are there other things that you maybe see people invest energy or space within their essays on, that you're actually not looking for, and that is maybe, if not wasted space, not the most efficient way to use parts of their essays?
Yeah. Good question. We talked about a number of those. I'm trying to think if there are other big ones that we missed. I think again the YMBA, Yale sort of stick to the prompt, and that's general essay advice. Our prompt doesn't ask for that. Um, I think Maria, your comment on kind of making it concrete so that it's not just high level and theoretical in nature, I think is an important one. I think we touched on that. So, um, trying to think of other big ones. I had mentioned, you want to, it could be personal, professional, but keep it, if it's personal, keep it within the kind of the professional realm, like something that's MBA relevant, as opposed to something that's kind of too far afield of that. Um, Trying to think in terms of other ways in which you maybe could have used the real estate more effectively. I think those are big ones. And I guess the other one that I think I had mentioned already, so this is maybe more of a summary, um, is it's effective for us to know what what the so what, as I said, what you learned from it, or what how you grew from um the commitment challenge or community, or how it maybe changed you or has informed who you are, as opposed to just being kind of a description of what happened. I think sometimes people miss out the, like, as I said, the so what, the why, kind of the connecting it to the lessons learned. And I think that can make it, less compelling if you don't have that connectivity there.
That's great, and that makes a lot of sense given how mission driven, the DNA of the Yale School of Management is so mission driven, and so it makes sense that that is something you'd wanna see, in applicants as well in terms of what drives them.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, Bruce. Well, I think those are all of our questions that we've had. Thank you so much for joining us and shedding light on essays in general and the Yale essays specifically. And maybe they sing, maybe they carry a tune, but at least hopefully they're not completely, a cacophony of a big mess of noise. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Maria.
guys.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Bruce.
Okay, that was awesome. Thank you so much again to Bruce DelMonico from Yale School of Management for joining us. And now, keeping with our theme of essays and essays that sing, we have a very brave applicant that has submitted their trio of HBS essays for Brian and me to review and to provide some feedback on, and some suggestions and ways that we think that they can take what they've currently written and maybe try to make it a little bit, maybe sing just a little bit more. So I think just a real quick background on this person. This is someone who has a architecture degree. And it looks like they worked sort of first in a design capacity and then they moved to more of a real estate investing capacity. And so their essays will focus a bit on that, especially the career focused essay number one. So I think with that brief background out of the way, we can probably just jump right into that first business minded essay. Just to remind you guys what that essay is in case someone is listening. Business minded. Please reflect on how your choices have influenced your path and aspirations. 300 words. So, Brian, what were some of your initial, impressions or feedback that you have for this particular essay?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is to always remember that your essays are part of an application package. And so you do not and should not repeat kind of basic bio data. So things that generally are not going to be in there is like, I was a major in X, my GPA is this, my GMAT score is that. Those are the things that in any essay you're probably not going to include. And certainly, then my second point here is a 300-word essay is really tight space. And so when you're writing these essays, you'll feel that. This applicant spends about the first third of their essay kind of setting the table, talking about their academic background, what they hope to get out of their career while they were in college. As it's mention of Frank Gehry, a lot of things that don't actually directly end up being relevant to the core points that they're making in their essay, and so you'll want to trim that out. A lot of times when I'm revising essays or making notes, the biggest thing that I do is just cut fat. And there's a lot of fat that's just there right off the top. And so remember, you don't need to repeat yourself. That if this information is in other parts of your application, especially in a really tight essay, you don't want to end up repeating that. And I think also in this essay, it's not actually really vital to this essay in terms of the points that they want to make in the second half of the essay, which is where it sort of gets started in earnest.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that in a 300-word essay, you need to trim the fat, but especially considering that it is Harvard Business School. This is a school that is famous for valuing brevity. In fact, in the past, their essay question explicitly said, what else do we need to know that we don't already know? Like they would flat out tell you, like, do not repeat stuff we already know. And while they've cut that wording out from their current essay set, I think if we keep that in mind, that that's still the school's ethos and that's still something they value, that only reinforces this tip that you've given. Another thing that jumped out at me about this essay is that there is a lot of repetition. So one of the themes or one of the concepts that this applicant puts forth is basically that when you're developing real estate, there are lots of different stakeholders involved, right? You have to think about making the design nice, but you also have to save money, and it also has to be accessible for people who might have some sort of different ability or might be in a wheelchair or whatever that means. And so that's great. First of all, number one, I think that's something that intuitively most people understand, right? That there's always going to be trade offs when you're doing a project. especially keeping in mind, again, for Harvard specifically, most of the people on the MBA admissions team are themselves Harvard MBAs. So you don't need to really set the table, to use that great term that you used. You don't need to spend a lot of time setting the table, pointing out, like, did you know that there are trade-offs sometimes in life? Like, yes, of course there are going to be there's always going to be a trade-off between cost versus efficiency versus making it beautiful. So not only is that sort of establishing that maybe a little bit of a waste, but then over and over again that basically I would say the bulk of the essay is this person making that point in slightly different ways. And why I believe that it's a wasted opportunity, and not just because it's repetitive and after a while you're like, okay, I get it. But also like that's they're missing the point. Like the point of the essay is not to convince me that it's important for buildings to be both cost effective and also to have accessibility features built in. The point of the essay is to prove to me that you're a leader, right? Out of the 9,000, 10,000 people who are applying, this is ultimately a leadership contest. And the essay doesn't really tell me about the leadership impact. It sort of indirectly references it, but there really aren't any specific anecdotes in here, and that's, I think, a real shame. I wish I would have known a little bit more about the candidate's path in terms of specifics, things that they've done.
Yeah, when I work with someone, I sometimes worry that I can feel a little bit like a annoying toddler that just keeps asking like the why. I want to know the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. And one of the things that I do try to break through when I work with someone is to just get them to think simply. And this is where, I'm not a copy editor, but where good writing can actually produce good content. And so, focus on verbs. What did you do? Right? What was the outcome? And those are the things that you really try to like get across. And so when you have a tight space, a lot of times I'll ask, like, what is the one thing you want to convey in this essay? Right? What's the most important idea? And so let that be the guide that helps you make choices about what you include or what you keep out. And I know this is kind of like a fussy writing teacher thing. But when they in the section where they kind of describe their professional highlights, which is, just for us, but it ends up being kind of very jargony. And if I could just quickly say why I think it's important in the planning phases to not write that. So they wrote and developed a winning space solution for a US based BFSI client for a 1 million square foot built to suit development, resulting in a contract of over $30 million. Now, my dad, as it happens, is an architect, and I spent much of my teenage life working in his office. So, like, a lot of those things are terms that I'm familiar with. But even if you're talking to me, I don't think that's how you want to describe it. And one of the really kind of funny things that happens when I work with clients is there's an intake form. Well, I'll just ask them basic questions like, tell me about something you did. And I make a point like, it's not important that you write well here. This is just informational. But so often that intake form produces better writing and more compelling stuff than when they sit down and write their personal statement, because they transform from regular person to I am in personal statement mode. So now I'm going to throw out every piece of sophisticated language. Don't do that. The best writing is often simple and not simplistic, but like stripped down and clear. And so don't overwhelm the person with jargon, partly as a function of writing, but also partly because it changes how you think about what it is that you are writing. You need to think about your verb, what you did, what's the outcome that you produced, and like, how are those things connected? And so if you strip it down to that level, then I think this essay will start to get a lot better about, okay, like, what is it that you were doing on these real estate projects? What were some of the specific challenges that you faced? These are things that allow you to bring up kind of the storytelling element that will get into demonstrating the things that you want to demonstrate. And so, one of the things I'll sometimes say to clients is if you have to tell me something explicitly, like I'm a great leader, I'm a problem solver, at that point, your essay has failed. I should see that from the examples that you use and the stories that you provide.
Yeah, absolutely. The old adage, show don't tell. I mean, we hear it over and over again, but it sticks around for a reason. It's because it's really good advice. Don't tell me that you're the sort of leader that creates real estate projects that meet all these different goals. Like, great, tell me a story about it. So I think if I had to give this person some actionable feedback, it's almost like the first, I don't know, roughly 3/4 of the essay, not cut them out, but I think they could be massively compressed. And then where they say, "Well, I have taken on projects to do these things for the company, for all of the assets in our company, focusing on making sure." Great, that see, almost like almost start kind of there. You know, maybe not literally start there, but that's the meat of the essay. Like, I have taken on these great, tell me about those projects. Tell me about that person that you had to convince who didn't want to save the money or who didn't want to spend the money or whatever it might have been that you had to overcome. That's the sort of story that I want to hear about. And also myself putting on the sort of nitpicky writing and editor hat. One of the things that they say near the end is, I intend to keep accessibility as a primary area where I will continue to work. However, earlier in the same essay, they say that, well, accessibility is actually mandated by law. And so that's great that you want to maintain accessibility, but you yourself said that it's kind of mandated by law. So I'm not really sure why you want a pat on the back for following the law. And I think this might have been a person who, has very good intentions and rightfully thinks like, oh, if I present myself as someone who cares about people with diverse needs and diverse abilities and accessibility matters to me, I'm gonna get points for that, which is true, but that can come across elsewhere in the application and don't actually not it's not a contradiction in the essay, but it's almost like this is mandated by law and therefore I'm gonna keep doing it in my career, but you have to do it. So it's not exactly the big, a reason for applause, perhaps that I think might have been the intention behind that statement. So I would just maybe cut that out.
Yeah. And I think that's also the type of problem that is solved upstream by making sure that you have an exact thing that you have in mind that you want this essay to say and to
Yeah,
accomplish.
absolutely.
So for the second question, I think that this is an interesting prompt because in some ways it connects back with a couple of the points that we just had in our discussion um, just now, which is that one, it is an essay that takes on kind of a non-business, right, sort of idea, right? This She talks about her work training in Indian dance, but it's also the other challenge here is that it doesn't quite directly address the prompt, which is at the heart of it is how you invest in others. And so what wonder about is one, if you think that if this is just like the subject is one that should maybe be avoided altogether, or if that's not the case, if you think that there are ways that they could have restructured the story or thought about the story within kind of the context of the prompt in order to tell the story well in a way that's responsive to the prompt.
Yeah, I'm actually gonna go back to your earlier point about showing, not telling. So this person says, "Well, they're basically kind of saying, I'm the sort of person who listens to others. I'm the sort of person who," but then there aren't any real specifics. So the core question being asked in this prompt is, leadership focused. What experiences have shaped how you invest in others and how you lead? How you invest in others. I need to be able to literally picture in my head you investing in another person or in another group of people. Here, it's a very tangential, it's sort of implicit. It's like, well, because I teach dance, therefore I'm someone who invests in others. But we've all had teachers who could not care less about us, right? So merely the act of being a teacher, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are someone who effectively or altruistically does in fact invest in others. And then the second point is, then they make this very sharp turn uh, to, well, and this is also how I work on multiple capital projects with the roller coaster of corporate teams. And whoa, because that initial establishment, that initial idea of, okay, me allowing me to picture you investing in others. And by the way, I think dance is a perfectly fine. It's great to be able to show that you invest in others across different facets of your life, right? That's how you prove that it's really a sincere thing for you. So I don't mind using dance as a context or as a way to prove that. But then, first of all, like really prove to me that you do invest in others. And then make sure that it's applicable to the second part of the essay where you suddenly pivot into this like corporate leaders and, you know, hierarchies and roller coasters of being in the corporate world. Like, whoa, it's not, because there's no strong established thing in the beginning, then it really doesn't link to the second part of the essay. What did you
Yeah,
think?
I think there's kind of one is there's two things that come to mind. One is like a content or strategy thing, and the other is a writing thing. The content or strategy thing is a lot of times people worry about using examples or stories because like, I got 300 words. I got to cover as much space as I can. But the problem is that you're better off saying one thing really well than five things not well. And so within the context of 250 or 300 words, you don't have to elaborate at great length about every little detail that happened. You're going to write that differently than if you have a 900 word essay. It will be different, right? But you still need something that's concrete and grounded. And so, more interesting to me than 20 years of dance instruction might be an example of a time when you helped a student or you helped a class perform in a way that was maybe relevant to what the prompt is asking. And then, kind of on the writing level, what you do need to do is provide something at the start that gives like a point of purchase, that's something you can grab onto later in the essay, so that when you make that transition to like, and this is how, if you decide to do this, if you say this is how it's applicable to the business world, that it makes sense. And that's not there right now. And so it does feel like a really sudden pivot where the feeling I get is like, here's just a bunch of stuff I want to talk about, and I gotta find a way to get it all in. And sometimes you just have to tell people like you have to be fine saying fewer things sometimes, that especially when you're talking about really tight spaces, you cannot say everything. Part of that can be solved by viewing the application holistically. Like if there's some aspect of, leadership at your job that you feel like you just got to cover, well, then maybe talk to one of your recommenders who is maybe, a supervisor on that project. Say like, this is something I want to include. And so like, if jog their memory, I did X, Y, and Z, and we did this. And so you can check that box instead of kind of trying to shoehorn it in to an essay about dance that doesn't quite seem like it fits.
Yeah, absolutely. And to put on the nitpicky writer's hat again, parallel structure in a tight space is, if you're not following it, it's going to be even more obvious. So if one of the things you really want to get across is that, the importance of an open communication style instead of a rigid hierarchy, right? To pick a sentence from later, open communication rather than rigid hierarchy. Great. If you're going to talk about how you are as a dance teacher, then tell me how you have focused on an open communication style rather than a rigid hierarchy. So that way later, when you bring that up within the context of a corporate setting, it helps it match even more. And if it doesn't match, then maybe go back to the drawing board a little bit and ask yourself, well, how does this dance experience, how does it apply uh, to the business world? And yeah, again, I think some specific examples would be good. And look, one place to cut out words is not only to use other parts of the application, like the recommendation is as you suggested, which I think is awesome. But even just realize, like, look, these, especially again, HBS specifically has sort of these readers that they don't cycle through readers every year, like where it's a fresh batch of second years reading the essays. It tends to be people who have worked in admissions for years, if not decades. And so one of the benefits of that, we can use that to our advantage because we can realize that they pattern match, right? In people from India who like Indian dance, or people who are of Indian descent who like to do the Indian folk dances, that is a very, very common theme in the MBA pool. Or maybe just coincidentally, they all end up working with me. But I feel like I encounter this as an extracurricular, and it's an awesome extracurricular. I love, if I could dance Bhangra all day long, I would. But the good news is, like, realize that the reader's probably going to be somewhat familiar with the fact that India has a rich and diverse history of this amazing dance culture and music culture. And so the good news for you as a writer, as an applicant, is that you don't then have to spend time explaining to me about this rich and diverse history and how there's so many stories and cultural significance behind them. I already know that. So that's great news for this applicant. It means that they don't have to make a point, like they're spending a lot of words making a point that doesn't need to be made.
So essay 3, if you will indulge a fast story, let me just say this. So the question is, curiosity can be seen in many ways. Please share an example of how you've demonstrated curiosity and how that's influenced your growth. All right. What they end up talking about, the applicant talks about their work for a particular school and the installation of solar panels. The story to me doesn't quite hit. And from time to time, I will encounter applicants where I feel like there's something to this story and I want to interrogate them more to figure out what that thing is. And this is where I'll tell you a quick story. 20 whatever years ago, when I was applying to grad school, my essay was actually about the fact that as a lawyer, I worked in Durban, South Africa, working for a poor school because South Africa had redone its constitution, blah, blah, blah. And we're trying to get equal funding. And so my essay, the first draft of it, talked a lot about kind of the different funding provisions, all of these things. But it wasn't interesting. I couldn't get it right. And I talked to a friend of mine, Graham, and we were just talking. And I just offhandedly mentioned that it was a problem because a lot of the students kept being bitten by snakes. And so he said, why don't you talk about the snakes? Now, I do not like gimmicks in essays, but if there is something that is like a real story that is explains in a really kind of concrete and pithy, direct way what's going on, right? It doesn't feel forced, then do it. So here, what this story is about, near as I can tell, is that these classrooms were overheated and uncomfortable, and she's trying to find solutions to this. And her opening sentences do kind of offhandedly mention that she kind of admires the kids for their grit and toughness, or, their ability to, like, deal with a difficult situation. All right, give me that story directly. Is there a story about, a kid fainting in class, or like teachers describing how they cannot teach and how, whatever it is, like, drop me into that moment. All right. Again, it doesn't have to be over the top. And if it's not there, then avoid it, because there's nothing worse than like reading an essay where like someone is trying to create drama where it doesn't exist. But I feel like this essay actually has the opposite problem, where you were dealing with a real problem that involves real people, then you created a real solution. But it gets obscured both in its organization and the fact that she doesn't really focus on the human impact of what she did. And it ends up being kind of like a very vague story where I don't understand the precise nature of the problem, why it was important, and specifically because she talks a lot about, there's a lot of fluff in it, I'll just say. She misses an opportunity to say specifically what she did. So what was it about solar panels that was complex? If you're an architect, that doesn't seem like it'd be the most difficult thing, but what are the things logistically about getting solar panels installed? Like, I want to know that story. There's something there. And so it's like a great movie idea that's just not quite executed well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the core problem here, or at least the initial problem, was the overheated classrooms, and we don't even get to that, a mention of that, until more than, I think, roughly halfway through the essay. So it's like the core issue is not even addressed until halfway through. Um, and yeah, I feel like there was some one place where if you're writing your essays, you can sort of ask yourself like, okay, am I being specific enough? Is there's some references to we or to our. So the project was funded and successful because of our collaborative efforts. Great. We are not applying to business school. You are applying to business school. So I need to read this story, and I need to be able to picture in my head exactly what did this candidate do. And I think this is another case. This is sort of a kitchen sink essay where it's like, well, there were regulatory problems, there were government, and there were vendors, and there was, and so by throwing out like all these things that had to happen, I think this is a point that you made in the previous essay, and it applies here as well. I'd rather know like one big thing you had to do instead of listing off a laundry list of here are the 15 different challenges. Really help me picture you in one of those challenges. And also keep in mind the topic is curiosity. And again, I can't help but put on my nitpicky teacher's correction hat. But curiosity led me to discover that solar panels could be an option. But you studied architecture, like you majored in architecture. If someone were like a doctor, I can see them saying like, "Oh, solar panels, eureka!" Or if someone were a musician, I can, "Oh, solar panels, eureka!" But for someone who trained as an architect, I mean, as an architect to say, "Well, solar panels, eureka!" Like, I don't know. Maybe I don't understand what's taught in architecture school, but it sort of seems like this didn't require a ton of curiosity. And so this takes me to another bit of advice that I have, which is if you think that some aspect of your essay would make an overworked admissions reader sort of say like, "But wait a minute, solar, like, shouldn't you have known about solar panels?" If if you think that that's a potential risk, then it's up to you to address that elephant in the room and to proactively say like, you know, in my even though as a trained architect, we had never done anything with green and sustainable building, right? Which then leads to the end of the essay where they say, well, that's why I got what was it, the certificate? I became an accredited green building professional. Like, then highlight for me that you didn't already know about something like solar panels, because it almost feels like, and if I were if I were putting myself in the shoes of a tired, overworked admissions reader, I'd think, you just really wanted me to know about the story about you helping the school, and even though it doesn't really fit the prompt very much at all, like, you're kind of faking, I don't know. Maybe
Well,
that's just I get tired, I guess.
well, I will say that every admissions director or person who works in admissions that we've had on our podcast, either this iteration or the prior one, when you're talking about mistakes to avoid or things that applicants do that annoy them, the first thing they always say is not being responsive to the prompt. That's always the thing. And like, if you're applying to 10 schools, that's a lot of work and so, people want to repurpose things or whatever, but you do have to make sure that the thing they're asking about is the engine of the essay. So curiosity does make an appearance in this essay, sort of the guest star who comes in late, but it's not the star. It's not the story. Yeah. It comes in and out, and it feels like, like, oh, they said curiosity, so I got to, shoehorn it in there quickly. But that's not really what the essay is about. If this is going to be about curiosity, to your point, it does need to be about how she said, this is a problem. I don't know how to solve it, but I really want to. And so I'm going to do whatever research or whatever, talk to other provincial leaders, talk to people in the education space, whatever, like whatever that concretely meant. It has to be you doing curiosity for it to show up.
Completely agree. All right. I think those are all of my comments, at least at least my major comments on these.
Yeah, and I
Do you
think
have
the
any
quick
other?
thing, just like the 30,000 foot view, is focus on storytelling, be responsive, and specificity is always better than kind of vague overviews. And fight the urge to want to say everything, because you will either say everything poorly or say the few targeted things that you want to say really well.
Couldn't agree more. All right. Well, Brian, thanks so much for being here and for your amazing insights. And thank you for tuning in to another episode of the GMAT Club podcast. I'm Maria from Applicant Lab. I was joined by Brian Phoebe from GuruFi, and we will see you on the next episode. Thank you.